One of the strangest things in human origins is hidden inside one of the most familiar names. Homo erectus is supposed to be the easy one. He is the traveller. He is the first great walker out of Africa. He is the long-legged maker of Acheulean hand axes, the ancestor marching forward from a primitive African beginning into Asia, into Europe, and eventually toward us. That is the simple story. It has a beginning, a root, and a direction. But the deeper you look, the less simple it becomes. The famous thing you thought you knew has been remeasured, and every better measurement makes the story stranger. In fact, it is not heresy to say that scientists have no idea where Homo erectus actually came from. Because when scientists compare the shape of the brain itself, not simply the size of the skull, the old line from Homo habilis to Homo ergaster to Asian Homo erectus begins to crack. Something is wrong. The tiny island human from Flores, the so-called hobbit with a brain smaller than a chimpanzee's, sits close to Asian Homo erectus in the shape of the brain. Meanwhile, the famous Turkana boy, long treated as the African model of early Homo erectus, looks more primitive in critical ways. Think about that. The small-brained Flores hominin living on an island at the edge of the world carries a brain form that looks more deeply tied to the Asian Homo erectus line than the celebrated African skeleton that was supposed to explain where Homo erectus came from. That is where the mystery begins. We have treated brain size as if it were the story, but size is only the most obvious measurement. A small brain can carry a derived shape, and a larger brain can retain a primitive arrangement. This is the reversal that makes Homo floresiensis so important. It is not just small, it is not just odd, it is not just an island dwarf. It has a set of brain surface characters that link it into the same broader pattern as Asian Homo erectus. The parietal lobe, the back half of the cerebral hemispheres, the contour of the brain in side view, the shape of the frontal, the outline seen from above, all become clues. And when those clues are placed beside Sanguran 17 from Java and the Zhukudian endocasts from China, the story stops looking like a simple African export. It starts looking like an Asian radiation, with Homo floresiensis sitting not as an absurd side branch, but as a living fossil of something older, smaller, and more fundamental. The old consensus rested on a clean ladder. At the bottom were Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis, small-brained African forms with messy faces, primitive skulls, and disputed boundaries. Then came Homo ergaster, especially Turkana boy, with long legs, a taller body, and a larger brain. Then came Asian Homo erectus, the classic Java man and Peking man form, with thick skull bones, long, low cranial vaults, heavy brow ridges, and brains commonly larger than the earlier African examples. This looked like progress. It looked like one species stretching outward from Africa and transforming through time. But that story depended on treating all these forms as points along a single road. Once the brain's surface is examined as a shape system, the road is less clear. Homo ergaster does not simply stand in the centre as the expected ancestor. In the new comparison, Turkana boy's endocast lacks several of the derived features seen in later Asian Homo erectus. It looks closer to the older African condition in important respects. The African material called Homo ergaster, and often wrongly folded into Homo erectus, begins to look less like the ancestor of Java man and more like a local African experiment. Now consider this. Homo floresiensis is small, but its brain shape is not simply primitive. Its endocast shows the posterodorsal depression also seen in Asian Homo erectus and later species such as heidelbergensis, Neanderthals and sapiens. It also fits into the larger derived group where the parietal lobe becomes relatively elongated. This matters because the parietal lobe is not a decoration. It is tied to spatial integration, body mapping, tool interaction, movement planning, and the coordination of perception with action. A tiny creature with a derived parietal pattern is not a failed human. It is a signal that brain organization and brain size follow different evolutionary tracks. Homo floresiensis had a small brain, but that brain carried a shape inheritance from a lineage already separated from the simplest African habilis-like condition. The frontal, is another clue. In anterior view, Homo floresiensis keeps a long and narrow frontal, while Asian Homo erectus shows a shorter and wider form. That contrast sounds primitive at first, but it also shows that Homo floresiensis cannot be reduced to a shrunken modern human or a diseased recent skull. It has a mosaic brain. Some features are old, some are derived. And that is exactly what you expect if Flores preserves a small-bodied branch related to an earlier Asian stock, not a random pathological individual, and not a direct miniature copy of later Homo sapiens. The brain is not telling a simple story of reduction. It is telling a story of inheritance, isolation, and survival. The most important comparison is with Homo Erectus, especially KNMWT 15,000. Turkana boy has become the icon of the African origin of Homo erectus, but icons create traps. His skeleton is magnificent. His body proportions are dramatic. His long legs and narrow hips make him look like the first great traveller. But the skull and brain shape do not settle the ancestry of Java man. In the brain morphology comparison, the African Homo Erectus endocaste lacks the full Asian Homo erectus arrangement. It does not carry the same total package seen in Sangiran 17 and Jokudian. Its brain is larger than that of Homo floresiensis, but larger is not the same as more derived. The startling implication is that Turkana boy, for all his fame, looks less like the direct source of Asian Homo erectus than expected. The hobbit, despite its tiny brain, sits closer to the Asian pattern in specific shape characters. That is the part that forces a different question. What if Homo erectus did not originate as a big-brained African species that simply walked east? What if the Asian Homo erectus line came from a smaller, older, more Georgicus-like or floresiensis-like population already outside Africa? What if the real root of Java man was not a tall African Homo Erectus, but a small-bodied early human moving through Western Asia, Southern Asia, and island Southeast Asia before the classic Java skulls appeared? In that scenario, Homo floresiensis is not a late mystery. It is a clue to the missing ancestor. It preserves a body size and brain size closer to an earlier dispersal, while Asian Homo erectus represents one enlarged, thick-skulled mainland version of that same broad eastern lineage. Homo georgicus from Dmanisi fits directly into this problem. D2280 has a small brain, a primitive skull, and an early date around 1.8 million years ago. It sits outside Africa at exactly the wrong time for the clean textbook story. If the first migrants out of Africa were already tall, advanced Homo Erectus types, Dmanisi is awkward. But if early dispersal involves small, variable, habilis-like or Georgicus-like populations spreading across Eurasia, then Dmanisi becomes central. It shows that small-brained humans were already outside Africa very early. They had the body and survival capacity to move through difficult landscapes. They did not need the full Turkana boy package to leave Africa or even to occupy the crossroads between Africa and Asia. That changes the whole meaning of Homo floresiensis. The Flores hobbit then becomes another survivor of a small-bodied expansion, one that reached deep into Southeast Asia and persisted long after larger forms had appeared elsewhere.
Have you ever wondered where we humans got our start? I mean, it's Africa.
Anyway, the usual African taxonomy also starts to look overloaded. Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and Homo erectus are often treated as separate species crowded into Africa around the same broad period, creating a scene in which multiple human species wander through the same landscapes with overlapping traits, uncertain boundaries, and fragmentary skulls. But many of those divisions rest on skull size, face shape, tooth size, and incomplete material. The new brain comparison strengthens a simpler possibility. These African fossils reflect a broad, variable, early human grade rather than a neatly divided set of clean species. KNM ER 1470, KNM ER 1813, KNM ER 3733, KNM ER 3883, and Turkana boy form a confusing spread because they are being forced into names that promise more precision than the fossils can truly give. Some are bigger, some are smaller, some have more derived characters, some retain primitive ones. But the idea of several sharply distinct species walking around Africa at 1.5 million years ago becomes less convincing when the brain characters form mosaics instead of clean boxes. The answer was not a tidy ladder, it was variation. Early humans were not sorted into perfect museum drawers. They were populations, and populations contain range. A large male, a small female, a regional variant, a late surviving primitive form, an individual with a broader face, another with a more rounded frontal region, all can be mistaken for separate species when the sample is broken and rare. That is especially true in early human paleontology, where a jaw, a partial skull, and an endocast can become a species name. Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and Homo ergaster could represent branches, but they also could represent a messy African grade, with the real later story developing outside that grade in Eurasia. In any case, the old picture of Africa around 1.5 million years ago as a crowded field of sharply separated human species is not the only logical reading. A single, wide, variable early human complex explains much of the confusion. The brain characters sharpen this point because they are not just external skull traits. The study looked at size-independent features: relative frontal lobe shape, parietal extension, temporal lobe proportions, occipital extension, the parieto-occipital sulcus, and the frontal beck. That matters because a giant skull and a small skull can be scaled to the same length and compared by shape. When that is done, the classic assumption that big means advanced becomes weaker. Homo floresiensis has a brain volume around 417 cubic centimeters, close to the range of small Australopithecines and below many early African humans. Turkana boy is around 880 cubic centimeters. Sangiran 17 is around 1,000 cubic centimeters. Jokudian examples pass 1,000 cubic centimeters. But the Flores endocast still carries derived spatial shape signals. It sits with Asian Homo erectus in the broad clade marked by parietal lengthening, while Homo ergaster does not simply become the obvious ancestor in every character. That is the contradiction. The small brain has a derived map. The larger African brain has a more primitive placement. There is a thing that happens in human origins whenever a fossil becomes famous. It starts explaining more than it actually proves. Turkana boy became the body of early Homo erectus, and from there he became the expected ancestor of almost everything that followed. But he is one individual from Africa. Java man is not just Turkana boy moved eastward. Peking man is not just Turkana boy after time passes. Sangiran 17 has its own cranial architecture. Jokudian has its own pattern. Homo floresiensis, despite its late survival, has its own inherited signal. Domanisi complicates the root. Buia and Dhaka complicate Africa. Soprano complicates Europe. Once all these forms are placed together, the question changes from when did Homo erectus leave Africa to what exactly are we calling Homo erectus? That is the hidden issue. Homo erectus is often treated as if the name itself solves the problem, but the name covers African forms, Georgian forms, Indonesian forms, Chinese forms, and sometimes even fossils from Europe. That is too much weight for one label. African Homo ergaster and Asian Homo erectus are not identical in skull form, brain form, or evolutionary meaning. Calling both by the same name creates the illusion of continuity. Splitting them forces the question that the old story avoids. If African Homo ergaster is not the same thing as Asian Homo erectus, then where did Asian Homo erectus come from? The answer is not clear. Scientists do not have a secure origin point for the classic Asian form. The trail runs into a fog of small-bodied early humans, partial skulls, broken endocasts, island survivors, and mainland giants. The logical conclusion is uncomfortable but powerful. Asian Homo erectus, including Java man, fits better as the expanded Eastern expression of an older Eurasian lineage, one that included small-brained, small-bodied forms, close in broad outline to Homo georgicus and Homo floresiensis. This does not mean Sangiran 17 evolved directly from the Flores specimen itself. It means the Flores form preserves a kind of ancestral architecture that helps expose what the Eastern lineage looked like before it became the classic, thick-skulled Asian Homo erectus. The ancestor of Java man was likely not a tall, clean African Homo Erectus, striding out with a modern body and simply increasing brain size through time. The ancestor was likely smaller, older, and already outside Africa earlier than the clean model requires. Homo floresiensis is a late echo of that ancestry, not the source itself, but the echo is loud enough to change the reconstruction. Indeed, this makes the Hobbit one of the most important fossils in the entire debate. Its small brain once made it seem backward. But small size is exactly why it matters. Island isolation can shrink bodies and brains, but it does not erase every inherited shape character. The Flores brain preserves a pattern that points backward into an Asian past. It tells us that the early humans of Southeast Asia were not simply big-brained African arrivals. They were descendants of a deeper, more complicated dispersal. Some grew larger on the mainland. Some stayed small on islands. Some vanished without leaving skulls. Some were absorbed or replaced. But the old assumption that everything important moved from Africa in one clean line becomes less secure. Now consider the real-world implication. If Asian Homo erectus came from a floresiensis-like ancestor, then the human story in Asia is far older and more independent than usually admitted. Java, China, Flores, and perhaps the routes through South Asia become evolutionary theatres, not mere endpoints. The Eastern world was not waiting for Africa to supply fully formed humans. It was generating its own forms, shaping its own brain patterns, and preserving deep branches that later discoveries are only beginning to reveal. In that view, Homo floresiensis and Asian Homo erectus are not opposites. They are two outcomes of the same ancient Eastern puzzle. One tiny and late, one larger and classic, both pointing toward an origin that remains hidden. That was where things stood, and every resolution has made him harder to place, not easier. Homo erectus was supposed to be the anchor. Instead, he has become the question. The African fossils do not line up neatly behind him. The Asian fossils are too distinctive. Dmanisi is too early. Flores is too derived in shape and too small in size. The brain characters do not follow the simple ladder. They form a branching pattern, a mosaic, a set of clues scattered across continents and islands. The more carefully we measure the skull from the inside, the less certain the old migration map becomes. In any case, the deepest lesson is that origin stories in human evolution are fragile. A fossil name can survive long after the model behind it has weakened. Homo erectus still matters, but the old idea of a single African species marching outward as the obvious ancestor of Java man now looks too simple. The tiny Flores hobbit, once dismissed by many as an oddity, has become a key witness. Its brain was small, but its shape was not meaningless. It points towards a lost population, a small early human world stretching across Asia, leaving behind Dmanisi in the west, Java in the east, Flores at the edge, and a trail that never fully connects. Something does not quite fit, and that is exactly why the story is alive. Thank you for watching. The next time someone says Homo erectus came from Africa as if the case is closed, remember the tiny skull from Flores, the long, low skulls of Java, the small early humans from Dmanisi, and the famous African skeleton that no longer explains everything. The mystery is not whether humans travelled. They did. The mystery is which humans travelled first, where they changed, and which forgotten branch gave rise to the classic Asian form. The answer was supposed to be simple. It is not. And somewhere behind Java man, behind the Hobbit, behind the broken endocastes and old names, there is still an ancestor we have not found.